this premise or this statement that God calls us to be faithful leaders. It kind of raises the question of what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be a faithful leader? And I can think of no better starting point than this virtue of humility. All right, it means to reject pride and it means to embrace humility. Well, what does that look like? What does the Bible say about pride? You can think about it from two different vantage points. Right? One is pride with respect to God. The other is pride with respect to people. Pride with respect to God, as it says here on the slide, self-sufficiency, reliance on ourselves, putting ourselves first, our rules come first rather than God's rules, my way rather than God's way. I'm not going to pursue God's will, I'm going to pursue my will. And we never say it that way. We never actually articulate it that way to ourselves or to others, but we know what we believe by what we do. Whereas pride with respect to other people is more of a condescension. My needs come first. I'm more important than you. I'm better than you. I'm better looking than you. I'm more athletic than you are. I'm more talented than you are musically, academically. My GPA is higher than yours. I'm just more spiritual than you. I'm a better human being than you are. And my needs come before your needs. Again, we'd never say it that way, but that's the disposition. Let's look at this a little bit more formally. It's all over the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And as you see here, it's cited as the cause of the fall. Right? Adam and Eve decided they wanted to be like God. They ate the apple, and sin came into the world. Pride is prohibited as in the very first of the Ten Commandments. You'll have no other gods before me. I come first, everything else comes second. It's the centerpiece, or at least humility, the antonym of pride, is the centerpiece of Israel's credo. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all of your strength. They would chant that. It would go over and over in their head so that the humility of that with respect to God would be central to who they were as individuals and as a nation. The very first psalm, it says, "Blessed is the man who delights in the law of the Lord." Not in his own law, not in his own way of doing things, but in God's way of doing things. In this cornerstone verse of Proverbs, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline." Fear, at least if you were to unpack the Hebrew here, it means sort of the respect and the reverence of God, is the beginning of real knowledge. Right? You've heard that before. This is where it's found, is in Proverbs 1:7. Or the very next book in Ecclesiastes, another wisdom book. The capstone of that says, this is the whole point of life. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is why we exist, is to put ourselves under God, to follow the one who created us. Or if you skip over to the New Testament, the very first words out of Jesus' mouth in the Sermon on the Mount was what? Right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The very first beatitude, right, is blessed are those who are poor in spirit, rather than those who are rich in pride, those who humble themselves before God. Now, when you look at this list, and this is a very, very small subset of what's available in Scripture on pride and humility, I mean, what jumps out at us, potentially, when we see this? You know, it's not just that pride is proscribed in a lot of places in Scripture, but look at the kinds of places where God talks about pride and humility. It's not just that it's proscribed in a lot of places, but in the most prominent places in Scripture. Right, the fall of mankind, the very first of the Ten Commandments, the very first Psalm, the cornerstone of Proverbs, the capstone of Ecclesiastes, the very first words of the Sermon on the Mount, and plenty of other places too. But if I have my hermeneutics right, if I have my interpretational principles right, it means that God really cares about this, cares about it enough to communicate it in the most important places in the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? Not only denounced throughout Scripture, it's denounced in the most prominent places in Scripture, or the flip side, humility is encouraged in the most prominent places in Scripture. C.S. Lewis calls pride the great sin. He talks about this as, he doesn't use the term parent obstacle, but that's essentially what he is talking about when he says that pride leads to every other vice. If we start with pride, a lot of bad things flow from that. Whether it's impatience, whether it's jealousy, envy, greed, any number of things will flow from that. And if we can, in fact, make progress there, then we make progress with everything else. All right, that is his point, that this is an obstacle or a vice or a sin that begets other vices. It gives rise to these other things. That's why we start with it in this class. We talk about what is faithful leadership. Faithful leadership starts with humility before God and before those that we are trying to lead. How bad is it? C.S. Lewis, who I think chooses his words quite carefully, a prolific author and theologian, he's not going to be cavalier about the words that he chooses. What does he say about pride? He calls it a spiritual cancer. He calls it the complete anti-God state of mind. He calls it the chief cause of misery in every nation and in every family since the world began. It's that bad. All right, that's his point. It's that bad. We need to take it that seriously. We need to make it a priority to address this because we all have it at one level or another. Well, let's get to the so what. I mean, this is theory to some extent. This is theology. Let's get really practical about what this might look like in the workplace. The chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. It's probably also the chief cause of misery in every workplace since the world began. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this Challenger disaster from 1986. Okay, good. What you may not know, though, is that the scientists at NASA knew this was going to happen. Were you aware of that? They knew that Challenger was going to blow up after liftoff, and they launched anyway. Now, this is January 28th, 1986. We're coming up on the anniversary of it here this month. But if you rewind the tape about a year before liftoff, Challenger had been flying and came back, and then the NASA scientists, the rocket scientists, looked and they saw grease and other kinds of stuff around the O-rings on the rocket boosters. You know what O-rings are? Like on your faucet, it's a thing that keeps it from leaking. Well, what they found was these O-rings had shrunk somehow, and that some of the gases and other stuff was leaking out of the booster, and they theorized that it was because it was cold. And when things are cold, the stuff contracts and maybe some of the gas was escaping. And their speculation was that at a low enough temperature, enough gas would escape so that the rocket booster would blow up. That's exactly what happened here. And so they asked the budget people and the decision makers at NASA, can you give us some money so that we can, in fact, research this and see if that theory is true? See if there really is a danger here. And they gave them a paltry sum of money and a few staff, probably not enough, but they went through, and over the next several months they investigated this, and their data really did bear out their initial hypothesis that at a low enough temperature the gas would escape and the space shuttle would blow up, right? And they communicated this to the decision makers at NASA. Okay, thank you very much. And they kind of brushed them off. The night before Challenger lifted off, January 27th, 1986, the weather for the next day was forecast to be 18 degrees at liftoff, 18 degrees Fahrenheit at liftoff. And so they hustled together this conference call between these couple of scientists who had been investigating this and these 4 decision makers at NASA whose job it was to determine whether they should lift off. Right? And so they had this conversation about should we lift off. And the scientists, as you can imagine, did not offer a single pro-launch statement. They said absolutely not. 18 degrees? No way. It's going to be a disaster. And these decision makers said, well, at what temperature would you recommend launching? And the scientists said, well, we've calculated this, and no less than 53 degrees Fahrenheit. 53 degrees. 53 degrees, they say. What do we want me to launch in March? You want me to launch in April? We can't do that. And so these guys decided 4-0 voted to go forward with the launch. And then 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger exploded, killing all 7 of these people on board. The scientists knew it was going to happen, but then the people who ultimately made the decision would not listen to them. Did any of you know that it wasn't really 7 astronauts who went up? It looks like there are 7 astronauts, but there are really only 6. What's that? On the top row, second from the left, is a woman named Krista McAuliffe. This was the further horror of this. Krista McAuliffe was not a professional astronaut. She was a school teacher from New Hampshire, I think. She was going to be the first school teacher in space, and she trained for this. And she went up with this crew. And the principal of that school was quoted as saying, everybody in the school, the students and the faculty and the staff, all came together in the auditorium and watched the launch live on television. And we were all in that auditorium, he said, cheering and celebrating with her. And then it stopped. That's all. It just stopped. That was his quote. And my friends, that is the bitter fruit of pride. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to have good ideas, but these guys, these decision makers, would not listen to them. They would not listen to the people below them. They would not listen to the people around them. They made a very unwise decision, and it cost 7 lives. And it's no different from many other kinds of decisions that we make. We kind of arrogantly, superciliously assume that these people can't know more than I do. I'm in charge. I'm the leader here. I'm the one with more education. I'm the one with more experience. What could I possibly learn from this person? This person is my child. This person is my student. This person is my subordinate at work. This person is my younger sibling. This person is a first-year student and I'm a junior or I'm a senior. Right? This person just doesn't have the knowledge, the ability, the experience that I have, and so we write them off. Not in the moment. We would never say it to them that way, but then we go forward and do what we were going to do independent of that kind of conversation. It happens in the workplace. It happens in leadership all the time as leaders think that they have to have all the answers, because if somebody under them has an answer that's better than their answer, what do they need me for? Where else do we see pride in leadership? What does that look like? Practical manifestations of it. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but just so you get a sense for how pervasive this is in a workplace. Micromanagement. I don't know if you've ever been micromanaged. Somebody breathing down your neck, not delegating, dictating every little thing that you do. Resistance to taking advice. We've been down that road here. Not being willing to praise people or affirm them for a job well done. Right? That sometimes is a manifestation of pride because it makes you look better than I look, perhaps. Or nobody's praising me, why should I praise you? Speaking over people in meetings. I don't know if you ever get these little measures. You're in some sort of group meeting. 2 people start talking at the same time, you and somebody else. What do you do in that moment? Do you speak a little faster and a little louder so that you actually get that space, or do you yield? I'm just asking rhetorically, but those are little indicators of pride versus humility. People pleasing, more concern for my reputation than anything else. That tends to be a pride thing. Putting career before family could be about me rather than about the broader good. Management by fear and intimidation and those sorts of things often are a manifestation of pride. Few other things. Taking credit for other people's work or keeping a distance between yourself and other people. Not just a professional distance, but I'm too important to talk to you. I'm too important to listen to you. I'm too important to be seen with you. That's just arrogance. That's just ego. Bragging, name dropping, those kinds of things. Insensitivity to whether somebody's waiting for you. The idea that, well, they can't start the meeting without me. I can show up 5 minutes late. Yeah, you guys can't start the class without me. It doesn't matter when I show up. But if you show up 5 minutes late, I'm locking the door. That's pride in leadership, and it has a toxic effect on everybody in the group. If you've not seen it, you will. And if you've not seen it in yourself, well, maybe you'll see that too, because this is something that affects everybody. That's why we have to talk about how can you make progress from pride toward humility. If it is that toxic, if it is that poisonous, we need to understand, is there a way out of this? You'll never get rid of it, but is there a way to mitigate it somehow? You can go back to a number of people who've spoken on this, but here's Ben Franklin. There's perhaps no one of our natural passions so hard to subdue as pride, he says. Beat it down, stifle it, mortify it as much as one pleases. It's still alive. Even if I could conceive that I'd completely overcome it, I'd probably be proud of my humility. As soon as you realize, hey, I'm being humble, then we failed. But actually, C.S. Lewis says that in the Screw Tape Letters. I think it's in chapter 14. Screw Tape advising his nephew, here's what you want your man to do, is say, by George, I'm being humble. And that undermines him. Right? Those little things, it's enough to turn a corner on this. C.S. Lewis comments in Mere Christianity, if anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him at least what the first step is. The first step is to realize that one is proud. If you think you're not conceited, it means you're very conceited indeed. We think we're not conceited? Well, that's a measure that we're probably more conceited than just about anybody that we know. And he also cautions there's no fault with which we're more unconscious of in ourselves. For those of us who have it worst, it may be hardest for us to even realize we have to do something about it. Here's a quick exercise for us. We're gonna wind down with this. We're gonna get 3 different measures, or estimates, if you will, of pride in ourselves. What I'd like you to do is write your signature. However you would normally write it. Don't show it to anybody. Just write your signature. Don't change it. Don't say, oh, and he's backing me into a corner here or something like that. The only way you're going to know if this is true is if you actually do it properly. So you're familiar with the science of graphology? And even if you don't know what graphology is, you could probably use your SAT roots and figure out this is handwriting analysis, right? Ology, the study of graph writing, the study of writing. And you might think it's like reading tea leaves or something like that, but this holds up in a court of law. All right, there are graphologists who look at our writing and they see it as a manifestation of our personality. It's an external sign of an internal reality, to use baptism language. All right? And so what they would say about our signature is this. The bigger your capital letters are relative to your lowercase letters, the more pride you have. But it's the gap that they're looking at. It's not a guarantee, but they say that may be a sign that you may have a little bit of a problem here. That's one measure. Another measure comes from C.S. Lewis. He says this: how much do you dislike pride in other people? When you see somebody being arrogant, when you see somebody touting themselves, bragging, tooting their own horn, when you see somebody name dropping, when you see somebody who just seems like they really could use a dose of humility, how much does that bother you? If it bothers you a lot, then maybe it's because your pride is in competition with their pride. Your ego is in competition with their ego. The way Lewis says it is, the reason you don't like the big noise at the party is because you want to be the big noise at the party. Very British way of saying these things. But that may be another indicator. How much we dislike it when somebody else is being arrogant. If it really bothers us a lot, maybe that's because we're looking at a mirror. Okay? That's a second indicator. A third one is this. This is from 2 psychiatrists at what's called the Minirth Meyer Clinic, a Christian-based counseling clinic. I think it's in Minnesota. And they put together this 10-item survey. Just a quick assessment of whether pride has gained a foothold in our life. So you go through this, right? How many of these things is generally true of you? I'll just read them one by one. Take mental notes on how many of these things might be generally true of you. I tend to speculate about why people are not as considerate as they should be. Is that generally true of you or not? When someone is insensitive, I let it bother me more than they really should. When they don't recognize my greatness or something like that. It bothers me more than it really should. Impatience or edginess overcomes me when people act incompetently. Is that generally true of you? Really impatient with people's incompetence. Sometimes I fantasize about what life would be like if I had ideal circumstances. They say that is correlated with pride. My moods tend to rise and fall depending on how others show me respect. If they're showing me respect, I feel good. If they're not showing me respect, I'm really mad about that. Right? Is that generally true? When I express my opinions, I am disgruntled if the other person doesn't receive them well. I offered my opinion, they don't seem to like it. That bothers me. How you doing so far? Don't answer that. All right? I don't know about you, I'm about 6 for 6. But anyway, I'm known for having a strong personality. I love that one. When I witness something good in another person's life, my initial reaction is to wish for the same thing in mine. Again, envy correlated with pride here. In social circles, I feel a need to keep an unblemished reputation, even if it requires a cover-up. I can't let them know who I really am. That's sort of a tendency of the prideful. And I prefer to avoid disclosures of a personal nature. I don't want to be transparent with the people around me. Otherwise, they'll know who I am, warts and all. Otherwise, they'll know that I'm not as awesome as they think I am. And that's going to be a problem. Right, now, what Minirth and I think it's Drs. Minirth and Carter who created this. They say if 5 or more of these is generally true of you, then pride has gained a foothold in your life. 5 or more. This isn't mathematics. This is not, guaranteed. This is an attempt to see the invisible, to see a character deficiency that we may need to address. And if Lewis is right, every one of us has it to a greater or to a lesser extent, and we need to make some progress there.